this afternoon. I want to offer you three sets of remarks. First of all, I want to do the very thing that this morning Catherine asked us not to do. I will offer you yet another ideal type, or if you like, definition of populism. Seems to me this isn't a question of being partisan or not being partisan. We either explore whether we are talking about the same phenomenon, the same thing on one level, or we don't, and then we can decide whether we take that understanding in a certain political direction, develop a strategy or not, but that's all part of where we have to start. Secondly, and I'm happy to have discovered yet another, in a sense, disagreement with Jan-Werner Mu, I want to talk a little bit about what populists actually do when they come to power. I think we can actually speak of a distinct populist style of governing, and I think we can even speak of certain regimes that exhibit populist characteristics. And then lastly, thirdly, I want to speak briefly about the question which is on the minds of many Europeans in particular today, how, if at all, to engage with populists, whether to exclude them, whether to have a cordon sanitaire around them, whether even to talk to them, whether to have coalitions with them, and so on and so forth. All right, first set of remarks. What is populism? Not everybody who criticizes elites is a populist. Populism is not just anti-elitist, although all populists, when in opposition, will certainly criticize elites, no doubt about that. But above all, it is anti-pluralist. The core populist claim, in my view, is that the populist or the populist party says, we and only we represent the real, authentic, morally pure, homogeneous people. It is a core claim to exclusive moral representation. When they're in opposition, they basically say all other contenders are illegitimate, and when these people are in power, they say that there's no such thing as a legitimate opposition. A couple of brief examples, because this might sound very abstract. Erdogan in 2014 said at a party congress, we are the people, and then turned to his critics, who are you? Viktor Orban in 2002, when for once he lost an election, famously went on record as saying, the nation cannot be in opposition. In other words, only his Fidesz party represents the real Hungary, the real nation, and by definition, whoever was voted into government now is actually unrepresentative and illegitimate. I have to confess I was very happy a couple of weeks ago when Donald Trump said something. This was virtually ignored because he obviously says so many totally outrageous and offensive things that this wasn't even picked up by anybody. But he did in a rally say the following. He said, quote, what matters is the unification of the people, and all the other people don't matter. In a sense, I was grateful for that, because that's exactly what I would have thought he had to say at one point. I mean, we all know who his others are by now. Muslims, women, minorities, they all belong to that other people category. But he really, in a sense, put it on record that this is what is animating his campaign. And if I may use an example that's closer to some of you, I think ultimately the same logic was at work when very recently somebody said, you represent Ishikalia, and I represent dimension. Ultimately, the same logic to exclusive moral representation. This, ladies and gentlemen, is what I think has to count as the core claim of populists. Whoever doesn't make that claim, in my view, and obviously there are other theories on the table, other perspectives, but if you at all are inclined to follow my interpretation here, then this claim has to be there at some point. If it's not there, then at least in my book, somebody isn't really a populist. It might just be somebody who criticizes Wall Street, wants to have a different economic policy, etc., etc., etc. But unless they make that core claim, they are not populists. Now, a further point that I think is important in this context is to stress that it can sometimes look like populists actually want to represent what they construe as the real collective will of the real people. And they very often sound as if they're just there to execute something like an imperative mandate. It's clear what the people really want, it's clear what the people really say, and our job as populists is just to basically implement it. But I think that's somewhat misleading, because ultimately what is at stake here is not a representation of a will. What is really at stake always for populists is a symbolic representation. They will always construe a symbolic image of, as American populists like to say, real Americans. And that, in a sense, then yields them what they always need, namely a criterion for moral exclusion. They always need to be able to say who doesn't belong, who the them is. But to be sure, this, in a sense, relatively formal and empty structure can be filled with different content. It's wrong to say that, oh, it has to automatically be racism or xenophobia and so on. These things can serve that function, but other things can serve the function too. What doesn't change, in my view at least, is that populism is ultimately always a form of exclusionary identity politics. That doesn't change. But the identities in question can be different under different circumstances. So just very briefly, note a couple of things that follow from this, if you're at all willing to go with me that route, because a couple of things follow that really, I think, go against a lot of conventional wisdom about populism today. First of all, populists are not per se against the principle of political representation. I think it's fundamentally wrong to argue that these people really want more participation, that they want to open up a sort of open-ended process of deliberation, and then let's really find out what people ultimately think and conclude. No, they always already know what people think and want because they have a fixed symbolic representation of who the real people are. And what they construe as an imperative mandate is essentially deduced from that image. Moreover, a lot of the usual understandings of, oh, we can identify populism because, voters are resentful, angry, frustrated people, that's not part of the understanding. Neither is it part of the understanding that populists necessarily have to have simplistic policy proposals. That may well be the case, but that's not an exclusive characteristic of what they offer, and it's not part of how I would understand them. And also, I hope it's become clear that this is not about a particular class, in the way that one very often reads in newspapers today that, oh, this must be, the lower middle class who is threatened by globalization and modernization. We can tell who's a populist because that's the kind of people who go for populism. None of this follows. None of this is part of the understanding here. So, why is it dangerous for democracy? What's the problem? Well, I think the problem is that populists always play up what, since Hans Kelsen was mentioned earlier today by Professor Sturz, Kelsen famously called a metapolitical illusion. Namely the idea that there really is a people out there, a macro subject, that populists can then play off against the existing institutions. That's why the expression silent majority has been so crucial for virtually every populist. They need, of course, to explain the obvious contradiction between the statement that they and only they represent the authentic people and the fact that they might not be in power, that they don't get 99% of the vote. I mean, this is such a glaring contradiction that something has to be said about, what is really going on. Well, what's really going on in their imagination is that the real people have not been allowed to speak, have not really had a chance to make themselves heard. There's always a way of coming back when they've lost the political contest by saying, no, the real people are still with us and out there. And whoever is not with us isn't really part of the people. Or, of course, the old elites have somehow manipulated things in such a way that the outcome wasn't right. So the frequently noted connection between populism and conspiracy theories is not accidental. Very often, not always to be sure, but very often they need some kind of account for why the political reality is so different than what they present as a sort of right moral picture of the world. And by the way, this also explains, and I mentioned this for obvious reasons here today, this also explains why we have so many cases where populists will actually contest an election outcome. So famous example, 2006, the Mexican presidential election, where, if some of you may recall, Andrés Manuel López Obrador didn't accept the outcome and said it was fraud, this had been the wrong outcome. He rallied what he called, El Pueblo, in Mexico City. They camped out for a couple of months. And he kept contesting. I'm not taking a stance on what the real outcome was. I'm simply saying he did that. And eventually he did concede. But what then happens is that basically a divergence opens up between the empirical outcome of the election and the moral outcome of the election. And they don't, of course, he would never concede the moral outcome of the election. And López Obrador famously went on record as saying the victory of the right, he was of the left, of course, the victory of the right is morally impossible. And that's just another way of saying we now have, on one level, an illegitimate government. So, don't get me wrong. It's perfectly right, of course. In fact, you might say it's the essence of democracy that anybody can make a claim to representation. In a sense, democracy is designed to multiply claims for representation. Any of us can go out there and say, look, I think people are underrepresented in a certain way, their identities, their interests are not properly part of the political process. Please follow us. We make you a different representative offer. But on some level, in a halfway functioning democracy, you just then also have to eventually accept the empirical outcome of that effort. It's almost like a sort of hypothesis you put out there, and then you see whether it's proven or disproven by actual voters. And what you can't do is always come back and say, basically any election where I didn't win is on some level illegitimate, manipulated, whatever it might be. But that's a very typical move for populists, and this is why, among other things, they're dangerous for democracy. Okay, second set of remarks, very briefly. What do they actually do when they're in power? Now, another piece of conventional wisdom, of course, usually says that populists almost by definition cannot govern because they're essentially protest parties. And protest parties, logically, cannot govern because once you're in government, you cannot keep protesting against yourself. So, in a sense, they either have to do something different, they have to cease being populist, or they will, as often the hope tends to go, they will self-destruct, they will be entzaubert, as a particular German formulation tends to suggest, and so on and so forth. I think this is very naive as a take on what populists actually do. I think we have enough cases now to find it plausible that populists can not only govern, but that they can govern in line with their underlying commitment to exclusive moral representation. That what they end up doing is not accidental, but actually in a certain way can be openly avowed and justified in line with their basic core claim to exclusive representation of the real people. Let me just pick out three elements of this briefly. And I'll do this in a very telegraphic way. I'm happy to talk about it more later. This is obviously a sort of huge empirical thing to put out there, but hopefully we have a chance to discuss it further. So, what do populists tend to do? And real-world examples would be Hungary, Poland, Turkey, places where populists came to power with sufficient majorities to really reshape the political system as they saw fit. I'm not talking about populist parties that have 10% and enter a coalition and so on and so forth. That's obviously a different scenario. But what do populists do when they really have power? Well, first of all, they tend to occupy the state. They politicize the state. They abolish anything that looks like a neutral Bavarian bureaucracy. Secondly, they, as we have now learned from many cases, they engage in massive corruption or mass clientelism, if you want to use a term from political science. And thirdly, they tend to suppress whatever might be left of independent civil society. Now, you might come back to me and say, well, look, this is just sort of classic authoritarian stuff, okay, maybe they do that, but, how does that teach us anything about populism in particular? Well, here's the punchline. In a sense, all these practices, even though they seem so problematic, especially the corruption, can be openly avowed if you bear in mind how these people justify what they do. Of course the state can be occupied. Why shouldn't the people occupy their own state? And what to outside critics looks like corruption and mass clientelism is just a way of saying welfare for those who truly belong and who truly deserve it. So of course I can hand out the 100-euro bills to those people who are properly part of the people. But of course the rest come good to hell. That's not corruption. That's a real democratic welfare state. Or so populists would say. And as for the suppression of civil society, of course it's extremely important for these actors not to have any genuine important pushback against their claim to exclusive representation. Because then, on one level, that claim could be invalidated. So it's not an accident that figures like Orban, also now Kaczynski and many others, what do they do in the face of protests? Something very specific. They are always immediately going to say that, look, what to you outside critics looks like genuine civil society is all steered by foreign agents. It's in the Hungarian case, it's the Norwegians who are financing all these things. In the Polish case, it's, you know, maybe Soros or, you know, whatever. It's some outside power. It's not real civil society, because it can't be true that there is genuine pushback against a truly popular/populist government. So, as you can tell, I mean, this is a pretty big hypothesis about a relatively small number of cases. But I think it's important to think about this more, because on one level, I think anybody who tries to understand populism, and especially populism in power, has, for instance, to explain how it can be true that some of these actors initially come to power and say, we're against the old establishment, we're against corruption. You know, this is what's wrong with the Kemalist establishment in Turkey. This is what's wrong with all the grand coalitions in Austria, etc., etc. And then they turn out to be 10 times worse. And it doesn't seem to hurt them in a way that one would have expected. And at least one plausible explanation is to say, well, in the eyes of their supporters, they weren't corrupt. They were just doing welfare for the proper, authentic, real people. Now, last thing I want to say about this, because you also might come back to me and say, well, look, I mean, if this is really true, why don't they go all the way? Why do they still have elections? Why don't they just sort of say, look, you know, we represent real people, let's be like Mussolini, you know, Schmittian understanding of Mussolini, you know, I am, in a sense, the real embodiment of the people. Why bother with elections still? Well, again, I only have a tentative answer to this, but I hope you don't find it totally implausible. Namely that, in a certain way, they can achieve everything they want without suffering what today remains a major cost in terms of international prestige, support, etc., if you officially abolish democracy. It's much better to basically keep manipulating elections, to clamp down on media freedom, to reshape the system in such a way that you get the right outcomes, which once again can be for them morally justified, because, you know, the real people have spoken and still support the regime. It's much better that way than to expose yourself to real criticism and real sanctions if you actually go beyond, you know, a certain red line. And I think we basically see this every day now in a country like Hungary, in a country like Turkey, that you can get away with this. Nothing is really going to happen to you internationally. All right, very last chapter of things I wanted to put on the table for your consideration. How, if at all, to engage with this phenomenon? Well, two relatively abstract points. First of all, it seems to me prima facie a mistake to simply want to exclude, to basically say, no, I'm not going to sit on a panel with these people, no, we're not going to have a political discussion with these people, we're not going to be on TV with these people, all these sorts of measures. For various reasons. The most important, relatively abstract reason clearly is that one, on one level, contradicts oneself if one says what's wrong with these actors is that they morally exclude others. And then what do we do in response? We morally exclude them. So we become, quote unquote, as bad as they are on a certain level. Obviously, I'm only talking about actors who are not breaking the law in terms of incitement to hatred or anything criminal. That's another matter. But as long as these people are part of the political process, as long as they can say, we actually represent voters and their legitimate interests, it seems to me fundamentally undemocratic to, from the get-go, to deny any basically democratic engagement or deliberation with them. Now, obviously, talking with them is not the same as talking like them. It's always possible to say that, look, yes, of course we can accept some of the themes you want to put on the table. This is not just all, you know, the product of some kind of populist fantasy world. You know, it's not like, oh, unemployment was invented by populists. But you don't have to accept the framing of these problems by populists. So some of you may have heard this example last night, but when infamously the Front National in France said, look, you know, we have 1 million unemployed, 1 million immigrants, it's absolutely clear what the solution is, follow us, you know, we'll implement it. Of course you don't have to accept that as the framing of the problem. At the same time, you can say, well, we're trying to enter a serious discussion about, let me forgive the good example, unemployment. Now, one thing though, and again this might be particularly important perhaps in an Austrian context, representatives who are populist have the right to be engaged with. They don't have a right to have coalitions with other parties. They can't say, I think, okay, we got most votes, and therefore we must take the leading role in the government. No party has a right to tell other parties, you must now do a coalition with us. If you have 50%, 51%, you get to govern, no doubt. But if you don't get that, you can't simply say, because we have so many votes, you must basically put us into power. That doesn't follow. But you, everybody else, has to talk to us? Yes, that's correct. Okay, one more brief point. It seems to me also a little bit naive, or maybe too quick, to try to say to populists, maybe on the basis of what I was mentioning earlier, if you're willing to follow me, to simply say, they're anti-pluralist, so we have to assert pluralism. That's sort of the right thing to do now in the face of populist rhetoric. Well, not quite, because pluralism is not, in and of itself, a first-order political value like liberty and equality. It's a bit like multiculturalism. It sort of sits on a line between fact and value, but it's not something you can simply play as a trump card. Diversity, more diversity, is not, in and of itself, a good thing. It simply depends on diversity of what, exactly. So I think pluralism, if you try to take it apart and specify it further, is really, and forgive me for sounding so Rawlsian, is really a kind of shorthand for saying that free and equal citizens have to find ways of sharing the same political space with others who are irreducibly different on some level. I can't expect democracy to deliver to me a world which is only full of people like me, or people that I like. That's just an unreasonable expectation of democracy. So pluralism, I think, ultimately stands for this disposition to kind of share a certain space with others. So it's a normative commitment. It's not a sort of shorthand for an empirical fact that, there are people out there who are different, of course, but nothing in and of itself follows from that. If you permit me one more final remark. It's important, I think, to stress that identifying actors as populists does not have to remain a sort of empty moral gesture. And it doesn't have to equate with, let's say, a justification of the status quo. It would be very naive to kind of assume that, okay, in Turkey up until 2001, 2002, perfect democracy, and then crazy Erdogan comes and blows everything up. Or Venezuela before Chavez, model liberal democracy, and then this crazy guy comes along and, messes everything up. Of course not. I think it is important to understand the causes of populism, but analytically, that's a different enterprise than identifying populism. And I think it's a much more difficult task on certain levels. I'm reluctant to assert strong causalities, that, we only have to identify this one factor, and then we can explain the European-wide or worldwide rise of populism. Of course, there are explanations, but I think they vary a lot. I think they cannot be generalized along the lines of crisis of representation. I think in many countries we actually don't have a crisis of representation. In some countries we have a very significant crisis of excluding certain parts of the population. That in turn is something different from what is sometimes lamented as decline of people's parties. That, for instance, in and of itself is absolutely not a sign of crisis of representation in and of itself. I don't want to spend too much time on this because we should discuss. All I want to flag is that, yes, I think anybody in this debate has an obligation to talk about causes and should not, of course, be in a position where, you come across as somebody who says, all of a sudden these evil people appear out of nowhere. That's obviously not a good position to hold. At the same time, we shouldn't make it too easy for ourselves in terms of, if only this one thing weren't there, we wouldn't have seen the rise of populism pretty much at this point across the world. Anyway, thank you for your attention. I look forward to debating.